To be honest, I didn't think we'd get to this point. I went from doing pretty much one servant a month to once a week, and here we are 6 months and 15 episodes later with The Last Servant and Fate Apocrypha. Now I know what you're thinking. I see this in the comments a lot. Since this is The Last Servant, do I plan to continue this series with another Fate? And the answer is yes. Yes I do. Fate Extra will be next, but I think I might mix in some Fate Stay Night Servants here and there, sort of like a special type of video in between. But I owe you guys updated videos on both Ruler and Rider, since those were very incomplete and quite shit if I'm being honest. So maybe I'll put those out before the first Fate Extra pull, but we'll see. That's enough sidetracking. We've oppressed this servant for far too long, and if we know anything about him already, it's that he hates being oppressed. So let's dive straight into the lore of Fate Apocrypha's Berserker of Red, or like Cake likes to call him, Pretty Boy Spartacus, the strongest gladiator. Little is known about where he is from other than that he was believed to be born in Thrace. It is also believed that he was a soldier in the Roman army who then deserted and for that became enslaved. At the time, a slave who had noticeable strength was trained to become a gladiator. Spartacus, being this walking giant of muscle, got sent to a gladiatorial school where he was trained to become a heavyweight fighter known as the Murmillo. I'm sure you'd recognize this type of gladiator as the one from the movies that's always fighting the main character, but almost always never wins. If the movies have taught me anything though, it's that history is almost never accurately portrayed by them, because Spartacus was able to survive long enough to plot his own rebellion with his fellow gladiators. Spartacus and 70 other slaves within the school gathered kitchen utensils and used them to fight their way out and gather a bunch of weapons and armor. Of course there was resistance from the Roman legions, but they were no match for Spartacus and his ladle. I mean, if I saw this guy and all he was carrying was a ladle, I think I'd be more scared of him than if he was carrying an actual weapon. Anyway, once escaped from the school, they plundered the nearby towns, freed and recruited as many slaves as they could, then made base at Mount Vesuvius. The Romans weren't entirely happy with this, but they couldn't respond in full force since they were dealing with another conflict in Spain. They sent over a militia to try to cut off Spartacus's resources and starve them out until they surrendered. However, Spartacus used his tactical knowledge to guide his troops around the backside of the mountain and around the enemy base where he'd be able to annihilate their camp from behind. The next militia that was sent over was also defeated, and this gained Spartacus some glory. More and more slaves started to join his ranks until eventually his army numbered near 100,000 slaves. They weren't as skilled at fighting as the trained Roman soldiers, but they were useful enough to put Spartacus's plans into action. By using guerrilla warfare tactics to raid and sabotage the Roman legions, he was able to continue to defeat any oncoming attack. This allowed him to reach a crossroads. He could cross the Alps and put a massive wall of mountain between him and the Romans, essentially guaranteeing their freedom. Or he could turn his army south and find safe haven somewhere closer to Rome. Both had their benefits and both had their risks, but before Spartacus could come to a decision, one of his co-commanders led an army of 30,000 towards Rome, where he would try to gather even more slaves to join them. Of course, this didn't turn out so well, and Spartacus ended up losing 30,000 men. The march of the rebels towards Rome was something that the Romans began to fear. The rebellion had been going on too long, and they couldn't afford to keep losing men the way that they did. They needed to end the rebellion swiftly. Now, noblemen weren't quite lining up to offer their armies to fight Spartacus, because they'd heard what had happened to those who had attempted before them. The only willing person was Marcus Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. He was given 40,000 soldiers to end the rebellion. Now, to put into perspective how serious the situation was at the time, Marcus had to treat his soldiers so harshly that he reinstated a once banned form of discipline known as unit decimation. If a cohort of soldiers was to receive this punishment, they'd split up into groups of 10, pretty much draw straws, and whoever out of the 10 drew the short straw, they'd be stoned to death. What better way to build your army than to get rid of 10% of it every time they screw up, right? But hey, this harsh treatment must have worked though, because Crassus had begun to win engagements against Spartacus's armies. The loss in numbers forced Spartacus to retreat until they had their backs to the Strait of Messina, a body of water splitting Sicily and Spartacus's current location. Spartacus tried to make a deal with pirates to escort him and 2,000 other men across the sea to Sicily, but pirates being pirates just took the money and left. Spartacus had no other choice but to follow the coast south, with Crassus's legion following closely behind, constantly causing small skirmishes. At this point, the rebellion had gone on so long that the legions who were previously occupied in Spain had ended their conflict and were making their way back to Rome. They were ordered to immediately go and aid Crassus in finishing the rebellion. Spartacus heard that reinforcements were coming, so he tried to negotiate a way to end the conflict without any more fighting. Of course, Crassus, wanting all the glory to himself, refused, and this had left Spartacus with no choice but to turn his army around and face Crassus and his army head-on before the reinforcements arrived. In this final battle, Spartacus was killed, along with the rest of the rebellion, thus ending what's known as the Third Servile War. This left nothing but his achievements in battle to be remembered in history as the symbol of hope for all people who experience oppression. And that's Spartacus' story, just a whole lot of fighting. So let's move on to his abilities and noble phantasm now. The first thing that you'd probably want to know is why as a Berserker class is he able to talk? Because normally, the mad enhancement skill unique to Berserkers should limit the servant's ability to speak. Well, Spartacus is an irregular type of Berserker. He can talk, but he can't actually communicate. Everything he does and says only relates to the one objective that he has set in his mind. This objective isn't set by his master either. Once Spartacus sets out to do something, nothing will stop him. It takes 2 command spells to stop him from moving completely, but even when those wear off, he'll just continue exactly where he left off. He has a personal skill called Unyielding Will that embodies all the dedication that he has towards that one goal. It also gives him this extreme resistance to both mental and physical damage. Next, he obviously doesn't wear any noticeable armor, or any typical clothing for that matter. It's said that his body's toughness is hard enough to be armor itself and therefore does not need to be contained. Since during his countless battles he never really got injured, only scarred, his body is considered to be one that can't be pierced, giving him immense durability to physical attacks. As for his weapons, he fights with anything from his sword Gladius, which actually isn't a noble phantasm, to his fists, which are strong enough to devastate servants that are physically weaker than him. Spartacus also sees no need to even dodge enemy attacks. He'll even go out of his way to be hit by them. It's because he has a sponge-like noble phantasm called Crying Warmonger, the Howl of the Wounded Beast. This allows him to absorb damage and store it as magical energy, which in turn heals him and makes him more powerful. The healing is attributed to a skill called Honor of the Battered, which constantly heals any damage over time. As we saw in the show though, if he's exposed to continuous damage from strong servants, his body will be transformed and extra limbs and tumors will begin to grow. He will continue to transform and store magical energy until he reaches a point where the damage he's received is enough to deliver a fatal blow. At this point, he would expel all the magical energy that he has in one blast, absolutely annihilating everything in its path. It made for a pretty cool looking scene when it happened in the show, so I think that if you've seen this episode, then you probably have a good idea on how this noble phantasm works. And that's Spartacus, our 14th and final servant. With this, the Fate Apocrypha Servant Explained series comes to a close, with exclusion to the updated ruler and Astolfo videos of course, but I just wanted to take this moment to thank all of you for taking the time to help me grow this series. Whether you've watched one of them, or all of them, or just even voted in the poll, the fact that you came to my video really means a lot to me. So as I always say, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll be around for when I start the next series. But until then, ciao!